Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the seventh edition, the seventh episode of Curmudgeonly Conversation, which is now on the Cerebrus Radio Network, thanks to the efforts of our friend Suzanne Sherman, who was the guest for episode 5. And we've had a very distinguished list of guests on this program. And tonight, we're very honored to have an extremely distinguished person, Daniel McAdams, the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel was Dr. Paul's foreign policy advisor in Congress. He has experience overseas, and he is a wealth of knowledge and also a target of the establishment censors who are trying to prevent the messages of peace and prosperity from getting out to the American public. So please welcome our guest tonight, Daniel McAdams. Daniel, how are you?
Hey, Dennis, thanks for having me on. Really honored to be with you.
Well, you're welcome, and we're honored to chat with you. And you often provide excellent analysis on the news along with Dr. Paul on your program, the Ron Paul Liberty Report. And then this week, you've been in the news regarding the Twitter ban. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened there when you made some commentary about Sean Hannity's duplicity?
Yeah, it's funny. We just finished the Ron Paul Institute conference in Washington, D.C. at the end of August, and I was relaxing after the big event. And I was staying with a good friend of mine, a dear old friend of mine, and he likes to watch Sean Hannity, so I sat with him to keep him company. I don't watch it I don't watch it at all, but whatever. So here he goes, going on about the deep state, and the deep state's against Trump. The deep state's attacking Trump. Okay, fair enough. But then I look and there's a zoom in and Hannity's wearing a CIA lapel pin. I'm thinking, what on earth is going on? I mean, do you even understand what the deep state is? Or is the deep state just someone you don't like? So I just found it really absurd. And so I did a tweet saying, this is, here's Sean Hannity. I put a picture of him with the CIA lapel pin going after the deep state saying, if this isn't misdirection, I don't know what is. And then I followed it up with a comment because someone commented on my tweet about how dumb he is, and I said, yeah, he is retarded. I lose IQ points watching him, and that apparently is what got me zinged from Twitter. And I appealed the ban or the suspension, and they said no, it's permanent because I had an act of hate against a person with a disability. Which, of course, is not true. Sean Hannity is not actually mentally retarded. He just acts that way. And even if that were the case, although it's not a nice choice of words, some people find it offensive. If anyone has ever seen Napoleon Dynamite, that's sort of the character I get into when I talk that way.
Okay.
But even Webster, the second definition of Webster is a foolish person, and that's certainly what Hannity is. So I was not attacking his disability because he doesn't have a disability. He's just kind of a jerk. So there you have it. My appeals have been robustly denied, and I am now in Twitter purgatory, actually in Twitter hell.
Well, and Daniel, as I recall, there was research, I think perhaps by you and some other folks, to see how frequently that word has been used on Twitter and in social media, and it's very frequent.
All the time on Twitter. Jim Bovard, I was talking to him and he did a quick search, and within 3 minutes he got several hundred examples of people using the word. It's widely used, and yeah, there are words that are not sensitive and maybe shouldn't be used, what have you, but in the realm of things that you see on Twitter every single day, including by high-ranking officials and blue check mark people, it doesn't even qualify. At worst, it's kind of a junior high level humor. Okay. I don't mind letting my id out to play a little bit on Twitter sometimes. I do have a warning on my profile that, things can get a little heavy because I like to make fun of people and I like to use hyperbole and I like to point out hypocrisy. And sometimes you have to do that with some humor and some ridicule. And, for humor and ridicule to be funny, sometimes you're stepping on the edge. You're stepping on the edge of good taste or bad taste. So, all I can think, Dennis, is that I had been targeted. I was targeted. I had been, I was caught up in the Peter Van Buren suspension/ban last year. It was just when Scott Horton, myself, and Peter were all suspended over what Peter tweeted. Peter is a former State Department official, and he basically said, "My job at the State Department was to lie to all of you legacy media people, and you never even bothered to check on it. You're so lazy." And that is what got Peter banned. And Peter, if you followed his account, Dennis, he was full of truths, very, very difficult truths, and he challenged the empire, he challenged the paradigm, he challenged the mainstream, and he paid for it. So clearly, and I was on a debate with Ben Swan yesterday, and Ben made a good point. This is not social media. This is social and political conditioning is what it's all about.
Right, and of course the key point again, as you've already mentioned here, is it isn't what you said. It's that you said it, given your viewpoint and the fact that you are providing truths, you and Peter Van Buren and Scott Horton. So folks like you are going to be targeted, whereas others can say truly heinous and reprehensible and inflammatory things, even urging violence. But if they're not found to be in active opposition to the empire and to the political establishment, well, then that's okay.
Yeah.
So
I was looking at a tweet that the Institute put out on something today earlier, and someone commented on it. You can't control what people say on it really, but someone used an unbelievably foul word for Jewish people and said some horrible thing, and I thought, this is like one of the worst things I've ever seen. It just goes by. Nobody cares. I mean, it's clearly a double or triple standard when it comes to this thing.
Right, and as you pointed out, it wasn't the Institute saying this; it was this random commenter that had
nothing
no affiliation. Has no affiliation.
Nothing happened to him. He was just commenting on something that we put up.
Right.
Used horrible language. So.
Yeah. So well, and the Institute, which does outstanding work, and people should support in any way they can the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. It is vitally important because we have so many voices and organs of state-directed misinformation and propaganda that we need the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity to clear the air and to set the record straight, which they do on a daily basis. But the Institute was, not surprisingly, the target, apparently, of it. Was it a denial of service attack on the website?
Yeah, that's what our computer people, our internet people tell us. It started on Friday, and they said it was massive and it was malicious. So we were down all day Friday, and we've been sporadically up and down. Today we've stabilized a little bit, but we've had some real trouble lately, and we have several safeguards to prevent against this kind of attack. But whatever it was, it hit us hard, and it hit us from the blind side.
Wow. I don't know how these things work technically, but is there a way to trace it back to where it came from, or can they hide that, or there's no way to see it, or?
I don't know. I'm not an expert at all. That's why, thankfully, I have a wonderful person to help out. But someone else has mentioned that, so I may ask our computer person what she could come up with in terms of tracing it.
Okay. With Daniel today, again, another momentous day in the news, and John Bolton, now the president's ex-national security advisor, somebody he had hired and put in place there, he's now let go, and there's a lot of celebration about that. Perhaps it's premature, and there's more that we need to see. But what are your thoughts about the firing of John Bolton and what we should be looking for going forward now?
Well, I would say there are two lines of thinking that I have. The first one would be if the president returns to the campaign Trump, returns to the views that he had when he ran for president that appealed to a lot of people. I'm a non-voter, so I'm not in the voting camp, but I certainly liked what I heard when he talked about bringing troops home and making nice with Russia and understanding that the Cold War is over. That was all great. And so on the one hand, if he returns to that Trump and he puts someone in that position, it's a very influential position that is more in line with that thinking, then it's a definite net gain for us, even if it's not someone perfect, even if it's not a Ron Paul, per se. It's still a move in the right direction. However, and this is the Leninist in me, and in some ways, Bolton was the best person in that position if Trump is not going to return to the real Trump or the Trump of the campaign, because Bolton was a great target. He is the epitome of bloodthirsty neocon, of someone who didn't want to bother going to war during Vietnam because he said, the war's all over. I'm not going to get blown up in some rice paddy somewhere. He didn't care about it, but he loved sending other people to war. He's a notorious liar. He helped lie us into the Iraq war. There's no country he doesn't want to invade. Even Trump himself said that. So in a way, it's good to have someone as evil as that in the position if you don't have someone good. My fear is it'll be someone a lot less known and only very slightly less evil. And there are a lot of people out there. There are a lot of think tanks in Washington where people just cool their heels, making nice salaries paid for by the military-industrial complex. And all of a sudden, boom, the number comes up. And here they go right into the position. And it could be someone with a lot of stripes and bars on their uniform, from the past. There could be a number of people who seem relatively innocuous, but in reality hold very, very, very dangerous views for those of us who consider themselves to be patriotic Americans concerned about the future of our country.
Right. And, it's interesting when you talk about the reactions of this thing, and I know you saw this and commented on it, but unbelievably, or unfortunately all too believably, the chairman of the Libertarian Party, who appears to be a very unlibertarian guy, and the party, unfortunately, appears to be very unlibertarian in many ways, made a comment that Bolton doesn't have a long record of lying. And what John Bolton? You talking about John Bolton or Michael Bolton? Who's he talking about?
Yeah, this is the epitome of haplessness. It's a shame. He's easy to pick on because he's I won't want to use the same word that I used to describe Hannity, but he seems to be an awfully naive person. He's a guy who makes a habit out of picking on Ron Paul, attacking Ron Paul. He was attacking the Ron Paul Institute over the fact that we were not enthusiastic about regime change for Venezuela, regardless of how you feel about that country's current governance. He thought it was just wonderful. We should be putting Guaido in power and backing him up, and how evil and demonic the Ron Paul people were for not being in favor of this. Then, of course, a few weeks later, we found out that Guaido made off with a few $million and his people were totally corrupt. They never have to say they're sorry. So the guy's completely naive. He has no idea what he's doing, no idea what he's talking about. This should be a banner year for libertarians, but if someone like that remains at the helm, forget it. It's just another goofy, another joke.
Right, and the good news is, at least there's the Mises Caucus. It has a lot of good people, mutual friends, of course, who are working to change that situation. So that would be a positive if that were to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are good people that are, that decided to work from within. I know that I don't know the current status, but I know that Tom Woods was getting involved, and that's certainly good news. And people like that. So yeah, it's if that's what your thing is, if you believe in voting in the political system and the political process, you should get involved and try to, get people like this out. But it's not for everyone. The whole voting thing.
Right. Well, that's an interesting point. Some of the people watching this, most of them probably are involved in that, and they'll say, "Well, wait a minute. This fellow said earlier that he's not a voter, and now we're talking about, if you're not." So, what would be? How would you express the idea of the advantages of not being a voter, or the reason to not be a voter to people?
So George Carlin. Just watch the George Carlin clip. That's all you need to do.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And aside from some feisty language in it, he's perfect. It's not the people who don't vote that get blamed when the guys screw up. It's the people that do vote. You voted for the guy. It's your fault. It's not our fault. You wanted a leader and you got him.
Right.
So, theoretically, would I ever vote in the future? Certainly, if another Ron Paul comes around, I could see myself getting involved in voting, but there's no point in engaging in such a futile activity for some marginal change. There are much better ways I think we can spend our time.
Okay, that was the essence of what I was driving at there with the question. But okay, so and looking at the foreign policy situation right now, there's so much to talk about there. And you mentioned Venezuela. We have the situation in Hong Kong, and that's kind of interesting because one wonders how much of it is a reaction of people genuinely looking for freedom from Chinese communist repression, and how much of it is one of these color-coded deals, U.S. regime change. Could it be a combination of both going on here, do you think, or is it all one or the other?
Well, it's never one or the other. The Maidan in Ukraine was not, one or the other. There were people that were genuinely dissatisfied with the situation, But nobody's talking about what Ukraine looks like right now.
Right.
No one's talking about all these, they're fighting for freedom. Have a look at their situation right now. And the same is true with Hong Kong. The people that are running the demonstrations in Hong Kong have been in the CIA and the NED's back pocket for years and years and years. They were on the payroll during the Umbrella Revolution of 2014. They've been on the payroll ever since. If you're some dissident running a street protest, you don't get flown to Washington and have a meeting with the National Security Advisor of the United States and the Secretary of State of the United States unless you're doing something they want. And it's not just my opinion. You can go to the National Endowment for Democracy website and see the millions of dollars that they've given these opposition figures. Only since 2014, they spent some $50 million. The whole thing is another cook-up. The only thing that shocks me is that libertarians who should know better are still going gaga over this crap, It doesn't mean you hate the Hong Kong people and think they should be in some prison somewhere. But it means that your ability to criticize your own government for intervening is far more outstrips your ability to do anything about China, full stop. So when you see our government getting involved in crap like this, that's where you speak out. You don't let them define the narrative and force you to push their propaganda. And you look at a writer like the Australian Caitlin Johnstone, she makes great points about this control of narrative. She did something recently, and I'm sure it's on the Ron Paul Institute website. I highly recommend your viewers read. She's sympathetic to people who want freedom everywhere, but she's pointing out, don't be a dupe, don't be a stool pigeon, don't be a pawn in the CIA game to destabilize China, because that's what they're trying to do, and that's the name of the game, and we should have no part in it.
Right, and she does do excellent work in talking about the narrative, which is so important, in the power of words and how they, as you said earlier, the social conditioning, to use Ben Swann's phrase. And it reminds me, the Russiagate hoax. And she had a famous saying in there, I won't quote it verbatim. We don't want to do that because of the language. But basically what she said is she doesn't believe it because she's not an idiot. Yeah, I left part of it out. But anyway, so she hits it hard, but she gets it right. She hits the nail on the head. Even though, and this is the other thing, we're building these coalitions, probably a couple areas where we might disagree with her, but she's with us real strong on some very important things, and it's hard to find a better person to have on our side, on our team. Glenn Greenwald would be another one, I guess, that would come to mind in that regard. But so that's a great point there. And of course, and again, you look at Venezuela, and I mean, the same thing was coming up with that. And as you said, that was just a horrific thing and just a joke of what they were trying to do, but with very serious consequences.
Indeed, and you talk about 40,000 people who have suffered when the sanctions were stepped up in 2017 under President Trump. You think they're going to come running to us as their saviors when something like this happens? 40,000 people dying because of sanctions. You think they're going to want to emulate us? If you truly care about people like that, you would be pushing our government to get rid of sanctions. Let's trade the hell out of Venezuela. Let's send everything we've got over there. Let's do whatever we can to engage them in business. The power of the free market. And Dennis, I know you believe in this. The power of the free market is so compelling. Nothing can stop this. And that's what ended communism in Europe. That's what ended the Soviet Union. The power of free exchange, people, idea, and goods. So if we really care about the Venezuelan people, the Iranian people, on and on and on, work on our own government, get rid of sanctions. Let's trade with these people. That's what builds bridges.
Right, and of course these sanctions violate the rights of Americans, as Jacob Hornberger and others, and Ron Paul and you pointed out.
Yeah.
But they also cause terrible suffering overseas. And Daniel Larazan is another person we should mention doing great work, particularly regarding the sanctions on Iran and the situation in Yemen as well as in Syria. Yeah. But what's happening there, people might find this interesting, that not everybody may be aware of this, but there are sanctions on Syria. And there's been the United States government telling the Syrian government in the past, I don't know if they've done it recently, maybe they have, but don't go in and clean out the last of the terrorists over there. Leave them alone. And say, well, why would they say this? I thought we have this common enemy. And they do this all the time. Then you see the suffering that's going on in places like Iran and Syria because of the sanctions. And so how are you going to win friends and influence people that way? And as you point out, the communist regimes fell. And one of the things that hurt them not only was because they couldn't keep up economically, but when people would see the Western lifestyle and the freedom that we have, certainly relatively compared to them, they found that far more attractive. And that's probably our strongest weapon, right? Whether they're talking about Cuba or Venezuela or Iran or any of these countries, the people want to be more like us, and then you have the people in power pushing them away. You almost, one might almost think that what they're trying to do is make the situation more hostile to help promote sale of weapons and electronic surveillance equipment. But that couldn't be it, could it? Or,
Well, I start to wonder, keep the enemies out there, keep it stoked up. We can't get out of Afghanistan. We got to stay in there. We can't get out of Syria. We can't get out of anywhere. And that really is the view. And, there was a great piece by Ted Carpenter at Cato, and he makes a point. I love it, but I'm also a little bit resentful when someone makes a point I wish I had made. but Ted makes a point, and you can find it. I think it was the National Interest ran it. But the Brezhnev doctrine was essentially that any country who is currently communist will remain communist, and that was the famous Brezhnev doctrine. But he said that we have our own Brezhnev doctrine in the U.S., which is that any country that's security dependent on the U.S. will remain security dependent on the U.S. We will never get troops out. We will never pull out and give them back their independence. There was only one exception, he pointed out, and that was the Philippines, and it was an anomaly. It had to do with the volcano and a few other things, and we're actually getting back into the Philippines. So that is a good point, and that really is the hallmark of an empire. And guess what happened to Brezhnev and his doctrine? Right. So that's the recipe for us if we don't start doing better and waking more people up to the fact that this is not making us safe. It's destroying our country.
We're less safe, right? I mean, even on the terror wars, the people watching say, oh, it's worse now than when we started, making it like the typical big government program.
Yeah.
Very costly economically, right, and financially.
Of course, and look at the debt we have. Look at the trillions and trillions and trillions, and it just goes on and on. People say it doesn't matter. Look at how well people live in Washington. It's really obscene. I took a little. I visited someone who was in this world, and I was just astonished at how well appointed these offices are, and how these people thrive. They don't even speak the same language we speak, Dennis. I mean, it's just a whole different world, and it's like a moral cancer.
And there have been studies of the counties that are the wealthiest and have the greatest increase in wealth. I haven't seen one recently, but I've seen several in the past where they were concentrated in just a couple areas. And at one time it was all pretty much just mostly around Washington, D.C., maybe one or two near New York and one or two out in California. But it's almost a Hunger Game-like type thing, even though not quite that extreme. But one does have to wonder, where does this all lead to? And it's really, could we even call it a form of socialism or participatory fascism, as Robert Hicks calls it?
Yeah. It's Fairfax and Loudoun counties that are the number one and number two, at least the last time I checked a year or so ago, the number one and number two wealthiest counties. And those are the two counties that abut Washington, D.C., where that's like where McLean is, where all the mansions are, Great Falls, where all the mansions are. These are fortunes that are made on selling death and destruction overseas.
Right, and leading to death and destruction for Americans that are sent overseas in some cases. And then we have, tomorrow is the sad anniversary, right? The 18th anniversary of the 9/11 attack.
Yeah.
And we look at what their policy wrought in that regard, what they sowed and what was reaped or harvested. That's not quite the right word, but what befell other people. And yet when we reap so many times, the people in the political class and in the establishment want to do something Bob Higgs talks about. Robert Higgs talks about truncating the antecedents.
Yeah.
So they want us to only focus on that one event, not look at what led up to it, and not consider all the price that has been paid afterwards in terms of human lives of American service people, people in these other countries. The numbers are enormous, and then there's the financial cost and the justification they use this for to rationalize their security state and their surveillance state. So we're much less free than we were previously. They tell us we're less safe. And it seems to be a perpetual motion machine, almost like in the Fantasia movie that Disney had. They're like Mickey Mouse after the sorcerer goes off and says, "Don't mess with these brooms," and then he does, and then he doesn't know how to stop it. But as you say, maybe a lot of people are getting wealthy off of it, so they're not going to stop it. And now we have the situation where my understanding of it is despite the fact that you hear politicians say, well, they'll describe the state of Israel as our greatest ally, and say, well, we don't even have an alliance treaty, right?
No,
With
no, we don't at all. And the Israelis don't want a treaty with us. But, back to how you started this whole thing, 15 Saudis allegedly attacked the U.S. on 9/11, and so we went out and killed 1 million Iraqis. How immoral is that? The magnitude, the grotesqueness of this foreign policy, that's embraced by people like Bolton and people who are still making their fortunes. When you stop to think about it, it's so unbelievably depressing and revolting. It's just it's hard to wrap your mind around.
Well, it certainly is. And another point is kind of interesting. One of the things that they justified through all this and Dr. Paul's talked about this, they had all this legislation they wanted to get passed ahead of time. And all the disputes over just exactly, what technically happened on 9/11 and that sort of thing. There was an opportunity to get this legislation passed. Hurry up and get all this stuff passed. And so there were things like the Patriot Act and different things, and the indefinite detention provisions of the 2012 NDAA. And one of the things that was mentioned in there, and of course a lot of us were trying to wake people up to it, how vague it was in terms of, if you were opposed to a coalition partner or did something, that was maybe not in their best interest, or spoke out against them, or gave substantial support to an associated force, and who was that, and sort of thing, So you say, as Scott Horton talks about, well, who is the enemy here? The real enemy at the start. Okay, it's Al Qaeda and then their offshoots, right? So who's leading the fight against Al Qaeda and their offshoots? Some of the same people that the politicians are fighting against, are arming their opponents. I'm saying, well, wait a minute. Under the 2012 NDA indefinite detention provisions, doesn't this count? And of course, apparently it doesn't. But it would, So these things are obviously just used as a way to give them a legal mechanism to attack us here at home. And so it's a very serious thing all the way around. And when we're looking at a place like what's happening to the people in Iran after 9/11, don't I recall that they had like 1 million people out in Tehran with candles?
Yeah.
And they were very upset over what happened. And they said, hey, you know what? Actually, this Al Qaeda group, this is an enemy of ours. We're fighting them, and they're still fighting them. So you think, well, we have at least something in common with them, and the Russians would agree with fighting against Al Qaeda. So you have to wonder just exactly what's going on, and why won't the people in Washington D.C. cease and desist from attacking people who are being attacked by Al Qaeda and ISIS and Al Nusra?
Yeah, it really is through the looking glass, Dennis. Who's fighting Al Qaeda these days? Well, it's Bashar Assad, it's the Russians, it's the Houthis in Yemen, it's the Taliban. These are the people who are fighting ISIS and Al Qaeda, and who are the people protecting them? Well, the U.S., Saudis, the United Arab Emirates, the Israelis. So the world has gone upside down, and if you say something like this, people look at you as if you're nuts, but it really is objectively true. And if you remember what they said about Assad, if he regained power, he would be wantonly slaughtering Syrian people just for the fun of it. He just likes killing people. And look at actually what's happened. You never see this on the media. Look at Aleppo now that he's had it for a couple of years. Christian churches are reopened. They're celebrating Christmas and Easter. This kind of harmony of multiple religions has returned. The tyranny of Al-Qaeda and ISIS rule is gone. They're rebuilding places, rebuilding the roads. So everything they said was a lie. And it's a big lie, and it continues, and people still believe it. They still believe the gas attacks. They still believe all of this stuff. And it makes our job a lot harder.
Yes, it does. And it's interesting looking at Syria in particular, because in our family, my mother's family is of Armenian descent, and so went through the genocide situation. But quite a few Armenians went to Syria. Syria has historically been a place where they were very welcoming and helpful to refugees. Yeah. Ironically enough, considering recent things. Yeah. So they had done that, and some of these places like Aleppo and Kesab was a place where a lot of folks had gone to. Also, Deir ez-Zor was a horrible massacre site, and there was a church there, the Church of the Martyrs, and we had a genocide commemoration. Robert Fisk was in town. and talking about, he had a lot of these pictures, and he said what's happening now is with the help of Western governments, including our own, some of the very same people who did the 1915 to 1923 genocide and other things, it's like they're trying to finish it up, and they even went in, destroyed this church and threw the bones of martyrs out in the dust, out in the streets.
Yeah.
And then you also had these situations where allegedly it was a mistake. Remember, the U.S. Air Force, I think, was bombing the Syrian army when they were fighting in Deir ez-Zor against ISIS at that air base.
Yeah. Oops.
Yeah. But then you see the funding and the training that was going on. We even had at one point, and you guys had it at the Institute, how there was a CIA funded group fighting a Pentagon funded group or something. So it's the theater of the absurd, but it has very tragic consequences in so many different ways. And I guess the last thing I was going to bring up here as we're talking about this is looking at Yemen, which appears to be, and again, I know they do some great work, and again, Daniel McAdams, the American Conservative, has really hammered this point quite well, and some others have also. What looks to be the worst human suffering and human rights crisis in the world today, totally man-made. Evidently, there were like 20 million to 30 million people who are at risk of death from starvation and dehydration. We've got cholera spreading.
Yeah.
And here we have a situation where in the Congress, they actually got together and did something that was commendable. They said, don't enable this by Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
The president vetoes it. Doesn't veto these horrible omnibus spending bills, which Tom Massey says, well, they're not even legal the way they're doing it, but everything else about it. But vetoes this. And here's the United States actively involved in the promotion of starvation and cholera, which is a moral outrage, and it can't be making us any safer, because like Scott talks about, Scott Horton, there's blowback and there's backdraft, and you're probably going to get both of them out of this deal. So what do we do about Yemen?
Yeah, well, at least the president's honest. He said, "Hey, the Saudis buy a lot of weapons. what do we want to cancel them for?" It's funny, but it's not funny. But yeah, that effort was led by Senator Paul and a few others. I think Chris Murphy of Connecticut was involved in that too, and they did great work. They finally stood up and did something. And I think if you look at how Americans feel about Yemen, they're not happy about that war at all, and they understand how miserable and horrible it is, and what a stain it is on our this moral pride that we have. So yeah, it's one of the worst. It's one of the worst situations ever. But unfortunately, our Saudi partners and our Israeli partners, because the Israelis are convinced that the Iranians are going to march in tomorrow, which is not the case at all in Yemen. And the other thing, Dennis, is that if you look at who benefited from our activities in Yemen, it's been Al-Qaeda. And this is not me or not some conspiracy theorist. You can find this in the New York Times. There was an AP report about it on the ground. Al-Qaeda benefited from our activities in Yemen. So again, you go back to this whole rationale for this 20-year, quote, war on terror, and what we're actually doing is a lot different than what we say we're doing.
It's horrific in many ways. Well, Dan, you've been very kind to share your expertise with us and your knowledge and your time. Can you tell us a little bit about the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity and how people can support your work there?
Well, we'd love to have people, sign up, subscribe for free. We'll never sell or rent your names, just for us, and we're not going to bombard you. Just go to ronpaulinstitute.org and hit subscribe. If you're inclined, we're a 501c3, so we certainly we make your donations go a long way. We're on a shoestring. We're launching new projects. We had a great seminar, Dennis, in advance of our big Washington conference a couple of weeks ago. We brought together 10 really, really smart upper division undergrads and grad students. They had a day of lectures. You mentioned Jacob Hornberger. He was one of the lecturers. Phil Giraldi was a lecturer. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson was one of the lecturers. And it was really a high-level, all-day seminar that we put together. So we're doing a lot of good. We're reaching out to young people. We're broadcasting the Liberty Report 5 days a week and just doing as much as we can. So, we'd love people to subscribe to our work, subscribe to the Liberty Report on YouTube. If they can make a donation, we certainly love it. And come out and see us at the conference. We meet a lot of great people. It's a lot of fun to meet people. And everyone enjoys, everyone enjoys meeting each other at the conferences. At the lunchtime, They meet like-minded people. They don't realize that there are so many people like that out there. So that is truly uplifting. We may feel like we're alone, but we are not alone, not by a long shot.
Well, that's a great point. The number of people who are awake to this and are aware of it and are like-minded is probably greater than what the media and the political establishment would like us to know about. So that's there. And again, the Ron Paul Liberty Report is on in the Detroit area. It's on around lunchtime, but you can subscribe to it too. If you subscribe, then you get a notification or something.
Yeah, there is. I think YouTube gives you a notification if you look for notifications. But you can. Some people watch it later in the day, whenever you can catch it and grab it and watch it. But it's 5 days a week.
Yes, and it's excellent work. You do the first 4 days of the week, and then Chris Rossini does the fifth.
Yeah, he comes on and does more of the financial stuff and everything. So, the political campaigns may be over for Ron Paul at this point, but the Ron Paul movement really is alive, and in some ways it's healthier than it was before because it's more intellectually cohesive, ideologically cohesive, than the sort of the frenzy of a campaign. So we should feel happy about this and build from there. And you guys are doing such great work too.
Well, you're very kind. We were fortunate to be in Ann Arbor when Dr. Paul gave the speech when the Michigan students started chanting "End the Fed," and that was great. And then, so I guess it was last year, he called in for one of our Campaign for Liberty meetings, and he was audio, but we had a meeting with him where he audioed into our group, and we had a lot of fun and learned a lot there. So, Daniel McAdams, again, thank you very much. I'd urge everybody who's watching this to subscribe to the Ron Paul Liberty Report, to go to the Facebook page and the website for the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. They do outstanding work. They have writers that contribute that are the cream of the crop when it comes to all this information, and you can watch their video reports, and it's time well spent, and they certainly are deserving of any support you can give them financially or otherwise. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is Curmudgeonly Conversation will now be on the Cerberus Radio Network, thanks to Suzanne Sherman and her friends over there, and so hopefully you can find it there. You can also find all of our videos at JH1776 Photography. Is that right, John?
Right now it's JI1776.com.
JI1776.com, and he's got a number of different series on there, including this one. Daniel, thank you very much for joining us tonight from Texas. I hope to meet and see you again subsequently at some point. But thank you for all your wonderful work, and we'll keep doing everything we can to help and be teammates with yourself and Dr. Paul.
Thanks so much, Dennis. It's great talking to you again.
You're welcome. All the best.
Bye.
Good night.